This program is a presentation of UCTV for educational and non-commercial use only.
Welcome, everybody. I'll make a few comments. One of my areas, is budget policy, and obviously, from a budget perspective, the dog that did not bark here is a lot of programs were cut. Personally, I think the biggest cuts out there in terms of people suffering in the short term are Medi-Cal or Medicaid cuts, if those are not made up. But obviously, UC and CSU also had very large reductions. What program did not have any reductions? The answer is criminal justice. So one of my challenges to the folks today is why not? If in fact the state is suffering, and California is not the only state suffering, why did the liberal Democratic governor not touch criminal justice when the budget's in such terrible shape? So from a budget perspective, that's an interesting question, and at least one of our speakers, I think, wants to speak on that. I would like to reverse the order a little bit in terms of your program. I'm going to have Steve Raphael start first, because he has data to show you, and I'm a great believer we should start with data. And we will go from Steve and by the way, Steve is a colleague and a professor at the Goldman School of Public Policy and has published, I guess, extensively on criminal justice and done some wonderful empirical work on criminal justice. The second speaker will be Robert Weisberg, who is a professor of law at Stanford University. And I think he wants to talk a good deal about realignment and how that affects criminal justice. And then Mark Kleiman, big view, publisher of great new book, will speak third on this issue. I guess the final thing I will say, and maybe I'll chirp in a little bit here, hither and yon. If I'm out of it, it's because I just flew back from the Big Easy last night, which is a very different world than California. And it's different in many ways, one of which is that the coach of the New Orleans Saints has chosen to move his family from New Orleans back to Dallas, Texas, into what is called the richest gated community in the United States.
It's called Realignment, by the way.
It is. And I have to square the circle here. And so, listening late at night when I couldn't sleep in New Orleans, I turned on the sports talk shows in the middle of the night. And the number one reason why he was moving back was that everybody mentioned was the crime rate in New Orleans. And one did not want to raise one's kids in a community with such a horrible crime rate. Schools were second. Crime rate was number one. So all sorts of wonderful things are happening in different parts of the country. And so with that having been said, and the other thing I'd say is don't mess with Texas. That's the other thing I've learned over the weekend. I was quoted semi-extensively in an LA Times story about the fact that even though the governor of the state of Texas has told everybody that California is a total failure, and please come to Texas as quickly as possible, where, don't worry, we have budget surpluses. Bingo, out of nowhere, $27 billion deficit, except they don't call them deficits, nor do they call them shortfalls in Texas. But this thing has appeared in Texas. So I made the mistake of saying something, one of the things I said wasn't true, based on an all PPIC study that I once supervised, but many years ago, saying essentially that Texas was in the business of low services, low taxes, low wages, and all that, and it's sort of different choices, sort of fiscal federalism that different states take up. All of a sudden, once this is published, there is a campaign out there informing me that I should know that Google has opened an operation in Austin, that Facebook has an operation in Austin, and I should stop bragging about Silicon Valley when, in fact, we all know that Texas is at least the equal of California. So don't mess with Texas and stay away from New Orleans late at night are my two messages. So having said that, let's turn to the data. Steve, you want to start off?
Good morning, everybody. So we spend a lot of money on criminal justice in California, as we do in the United States. And the reason why we spend a lot of money largely in criminal justice is because we incarcerate a lot of people. So the picture that I'm showing you right here is the number of incarcerated people in California per 100,000 state residents. From the 1960s to the present, you can see it's increased quite a bit over roughly about a 25-year period. Interestingly, in recent years, the number of people we have in prison has actually dropped a little bit, so it peaked at around 175,000 a few years ago, and as of midnight last Wednesday, I think it was 161,000. So there have been some reforms that are pushing people out, but for the most part, we have a pretty high incarceration rate. It's at the national average, but the national average is pretty high, and as a consequence, we spend a lot of money. So if we look at the proportion of our general fund that's devoted to criminal justice, this is just a comparison from the Legislative Analyst Office of fiscal year 84-85 to fiscal year 09-010. You can see the proportion of the budget going to criminal justice has more than doubled, and not surprisingly, the proportion of the budget going to other discretionary categories, University of California, California state system, mental health, social services has declined. So, it is, it's not the lion's share of what we're spending money on, but 10% of our budget is quite a bit. Just to give you some idea of what we spend per inmate, these are further figures from the Legislative Analyst Office that just gives sort of an estimate of the per inmate costs, and we can quibble about how these are calculated because are they average or are they marginal, but if we just take the total cost of the system divided by the number of inmates, it's on the order of $43,000 per person per year, so it's pretty expensive. And it's expensive, and in sort of current times, one might ask, well, are we getting our money's worth in terms of crime reduction or rehabilitation or whatever else it is, the social objective that we seem to be maximizing by putting so many people in prison. Now, one of the questions posed to us is, could we cut the corrections budget? Could we just reduce the amount of money we're allotting to corrections and sort of fix the problem that way? And I think what I would argue is that while clearly there are economic interests associated with incarcerating people, what's determining how much we spend on corrections isn't necessarily how much we're allotting on an annual basis, but it's our sentencing system, which is deciding who we're sending to prison and how long we're sending them to prison for. And so cutting budgets, okay, in the face of a given number of incarcerated people is the equivalent of just saying you just have to spend less per inmate and make it work somehow. And of course, that's just going to mean that inmates' conditions will be worse, prisons would be more crowded, safety in prisons will deteriorate, the conditions for guards will get worse, and so on and so forth. So the sort of one of the main points I'd like to make is that if we really wanted to spend less on corrections, then what we would have to do is we'd have to reform our sentencing structure in a way that did a better job of identifying those who are the most criminally active and the most dangerous to society, and put those people away, and then find those people who perhaps are not so dangerous and are not so much of a danger to society, and not put them away. Think of alternative sanctions for them that would be more effective. Now, I just wanted to show a couple slides that sort of make the direct connection between some of the policies that we have collectively decided to implement either through the legislature or through the initiative system and the structure of our incarcerated population. So the picture that's on the screen right now shows the age distribution of the prison population in California. And if you look at that picture really hard, what you see is starting around 93, 94, the prison population ages considerably, which is...
It's really hard to read the legend, so why don't you say
oh, I'm sorry.
color is, Steve?
So this purple is those that are 50 years and older. These are people that are 40 to 49, and then the dark blue on top is 18 to 29, and the red is 30 to 39. And then the key is around here, 93, 94. What you can see is that the proportion of inmates that are relatively young declines, the proportion of inmates that are older increases, which from a from a crime control point of view, is not perhaps the optimal way to do things, because younger people tend to be more criminally active than older people. In fact, assistance rises quite high or at a high rate with age. But what we're seeing here basically is the effect of the Three Strikes Initiative that passed in '94, whereby we greatly enhance the sentences for second felonies, oftentimes nonviolent felonies, and we greatly enhance the sentences for third felonies from 25 years to life. And as a result, we have an older prison population. And not surprisingly, we have a prison population that probably would be committing less crime if it was on the street today than it was in the past, and at higher cost in terms of what we have to pay for health care and for other expenditures. Just another example, this is a picture of the blue line is the proportion of male offenders that are incarcerated for a drug offense. The green line is the proportion that are incarcerated for a violent offense. And what you can see is that around 2000, this series for the drug offenses takes a turn, right, where the proportion in for drug offenses declines. If we do it for women, let me go one up. If you do it for women, you see even a larger drop. And what's happening there is we passed a different proposition in 2000, Prop 36, which diverted some drug offenders from prison to alternative sanctions and drug courts. The whole point of these pictures is that our policy choices are determining the size of our prison population, and they're determining the internal composition and costs of our prison population. And hence, if we really wanted to reduce expenditures on incarceration, we'd have to reduce sentencing, and we'd have to use sentencing a little bit more judiciously and a little bit more efficiently. Now, one other point I'd like to make before I stop is that there's also a connection between the sentences we choose and the way the prison population is internally managed, associated with, and this is driven largely by a series of rules that govern the conditions under which we incarcerate people. So for the California Department of Corrections Rehabilitation has a scoring system whereby when you come into prison, you're assessed what's called a placement score, security housing score, where the longer your sentence, the sort of aspects of your offense, whether you're a repeat offender and a whole bunch of other things, are accumulated to give you a score that decides whether you're in a level 1 prison, a level 2 facility, level 3 facility, level 4 facility. And as we get up into the higher security facilities, the amount of labor that is used to guard that inmate goes up considerably. The amount of capital that's used to watch that inmate goes up considerably. So for example, in level 4, everybody's in cells, and anytime an inmate has to go outside, it has to be the inmate has to be accompanied by 2 armed guards, and the person's in shackles. And it's really a lot more of a high-cost, high-security environment. Well, one of the key factors that determines your security score is essentially the number of years you've been sentenced to prison. So if we enhance the years that we're sentencing to prison, it just mechanically increases the average security level of the inmates that we're admitting. And in the process, it also makes first of all, it makes for a sort of harsher conditions for the inmates that are doing time. And second of all, it also means that we're going to be spending more per inmate in terms of just simple capital and labor costs associated with guarding the person during their period of incarceration. And so small changes on the sentencing policy actually end up wagging the whole dog all the way through the criminal justice system. So I don't think I would ever advocate for wholesale large cuts to the Department of Corrections, because in essence they have to incarcerate who we send to them, and who we send them is something that is the sort of result of a whole series of ancillary public choices, of course, that are imperfect in their nature, and whether or not they reflect the will of the people is an open question. But it suggests that this is just in some ways a symptom of a sentencing policy that has become increasingly tougher. So if we want to spend less money, then we have to alter the sentencing policy, and we have to do it in a manner that is relatively smart and tries not to aggravate crime in the process. And that's what our next speakers are going to talk about. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Professor Robert Weisberg, excuse me, at the law school, Stanford University, who, as I said before, is going to talk about devolution or realignment.
Am I on? Yeah. I will get to devolution realignment in a minute. I want to kind of build up to it briefly. First, I'm going to reinforce a couple of things that Steve said and augment them a little. It's important to note that California's incarceration rate, just a snapshot ratio of people in prison to population, is high, but it's not anomalously high by American state standards. It's about average. So how did we become the most notoriously dysfunctional system? Well, there's another ratio, first of all, that you have to take into account, which is prison capacity as compared to number of people. We're the only state which, and I'll get to this in a little more detail in a second, is under almost entirely federal judicial control in terms of its prison system, and that's because of overcrowding. And you know, overcrowding measures are perhaps more art than science, but the key ratio there is about 1.4 to 1 in terms of number of prisoners to legitimate prison bed spaces. The other thing that is anomalous about California is its recidivism rate, but that is an extremely complicated and somewhat artificial notion. And to explain that, because I think it might be helpful, I need to say a couple of things about parole, because that's going to be relevant here. There are two kinds of parole in California. Most state prisoners who are there for crimes for which they receive so-called determinate sentences under the determinate sentencing law. And this is independent of three strikes. It goes back to, well, we had a governor, his name was Jerry Brown, some years back. And yeah, ancient history. So the determinate sentencing law was enacted in 1977, and your typical state prisoner is in there from anywhere from 2 to about 7 years for serious drug offenses, robberies, burglaries, things like that. All those people, after they are released, once their term is set, automatically go on 3 years parole. It's not as if there's a parole board deciding whether to release them. The release date is pretty much a mathematical decision. Then they automatically go on 3 years parole. A key problem associated with that kind of mandatory parole is that huge numbers of those parolees wind up back in state prison within a year or two. In some cases because they committed whole new crimes, and they are actually resentenced for the new crimes. But to a greater extent, they're sent back to prison for parole violations. Some of those parole violations are actually new crimes where the district attorneys decide, why go through the whole due process problem of convicting them for a crime? Let's just recharacterize the new crime as a parole violation, which it surely is. But many of those parole violations are not crimes. They're technical violations of conditions of parole, violations of curfews and various kinds of restrictions. So you have some low-level decisions being made, sometimes by parole officers, sometimes by local district attorneys, that get people in and out of the system. So it's not just the overcrowding, but it's actually the nature of the real estate allocation within the prisons. If you go into most state prisons, they have something that are characterized under the exquisite euphemism called reception centers, which sounds like the lobby of your Four Seasons. But they're basically dormitories, sometimes triple bunked. They're not celled, they're just big rooms, where prisoners stay for a month, 2 months, or 3 months, in theory, while they are awaiting being sent into general classification, but many of them spend their whole revocation terms there, and they're in and out. So that the chaotic inflow and outflow of prisons is a significant thing. There is still, to some significant degree, old-fashioned lifer parole in California. That is to say, people serving what are theoretically life sentences, but where they have, in theory, a statutory right to be considered for parole, and that there is still a board, something with a change of name, but it's still basically a parole board doing that. Some of those, as Steve suggested, are three strikers, but a lot of them are just old-fashioned lifers who are in for serious crimes that fall outside the determinate sentencing law, for homicide, kidnapping, rape, and various attempt crimes. California has about 20 to 25,000 people on plain old life parole out of about 160,000 people in state prison. That's a very, very high percentage. Okay, next. What would it mean to cut the budget? Well, one way to look at it is, since there's so much sleight of hand that is always involved in calculating budgets, let's do a little sleight of hand. If the governor simply did not increase the budget for criminal justice, you might say he is cutting it. Normally, we think of the baseline as what we're currently spending. But because of the federal court injunction, which at least temporarily has ordered a reduction in the overpopulation in California, you could just recalculate the baseline as, 30% more than we're spending now. Mind you, the federal judges have not ordered a release. They've ordered a reduction in the ratio, the overcrowding ratio, although release may be the only way to do it. So in that sense, hey, if we just can avoid spending more money, we'll be cutting the budget by 20 or 30%. Now again, sleight of hand, but it's just worth noting that there are external constraints. Okay, now, where could you really start cutting money? Let's talk about first what has already been done, started under the Schwarzenegger administration towards the end of it. Importantly, and this is to reinforce the second point Steve made, it's very, very hard to confront the underlying issues without legislative changes in sentencing, or more specifically, in actual amendments to the California Penal Code. That is unbelievably difficult to do. If you talk about political blockages to reform or budget cutbacks, the easy target is always, let's all say it together, the California Prison Guards Union. I think the California Prison Guards Union is an interesting and somewhat misunderstood entity. It probably has less power than people think, less power now than it used to, under the Davis administration, certainly. Second of all, sure, it is an unequivocally self-interested, rent-seeking entity. But that doesn't mean that its interests always align with keeping up prison budgets. That's something of a non sequitur. They want more money, they want more jobs. They don't necessarily benefit from more prisons. In fact, sometimes it's the worst thing that can happen to them. If more prisons are built, but the staffing ratio doesn't keep up with that, so that prison guards are not getting more jobs and they're facing bigger security concerns. If you had to pick an interest group that is a blockage here, it's actually the law enforcement associations, especially the California District Attorneys Association, which has fought vigorously against penal code reform. I'm not saying they're wrong. They may be right in a number of ways, but that's where the real blockage is in terms of affecting the legislature. Okay. What got done towards the end of the Schwarzenegger administration? Some changes in the parole rules, whereby the rather inefficient allocation or inefficient workload allocation of parole officials was reconfigured a little. If parole officials are supervising everybody on parole, this is the mandatory parole, they're going to find lots of reasons for revoking people, violating people, and sending them back into prison. And a lot of that is inefficient because a lot of the people being sent back in, they did some bad stuff, but they're not particularly dangerous. So one thing that the last administration did is to try to do some triaging with parole workloads and have them focus on the really serious people and not worry about supervising the less serious people. This has probably helped a little, and it isn't getting much attention. Second of all, something which might happen in the next few months below the radar, and the important thing about it, again, is it would not require any legislative change, because that's the obstacle, and that is life parole and changing some of the subtle internal rules of the actual parole hearing process, whereby lifers have a slightly better chance of getting released. This is particularly important in terms of the aging population. There's nothing subtle about the correlation between criminal proclivities and age. It depends on the crime to some extent. You can probably commit securities fraud when you're 70. I've known some people who've done it. It's kind of hard to commit violent crime. The best analogy is how many NFL running backs are there right now aged 40 and over, okay? This explains also why health care has become such a cost to the state. Steve puts it in terms of the state cost, but mind you, the health care is really being run now by a federal judge through a receivership. And here's simply a way to capture it. I've spent a lot of time in San Quentin, well, legally, normally representing people on appeals, but I recently had a chance to tour the health care facilities within San Quentin, which are interesting. I'll simply capture it in an admittedly sleazy soundbite, okay? This is totally out of context, but not entirely. One of the new innovations in San Quentin is a very state-of-the-art, I'm going to try to gasp before I say this to get the air out, geriatric chemotherapy clinic, okay? It would be, you might think it would be cheaper if a 65-year-old prisoner was getting chemotherapy outside of prison. There would be some economies of scale there because you'd be doing it at Marin General Hospital or something like that, but there'd still be great security costs, okay? There's some thought that the governor will start under the radar sort of tweaking the parole revocation? I'm sorry, parole release process for lifers, which might affect some savings there. Okay, but now let me just say a few words about realignment or devolution, various terms that are being used. I don't know whether this is the right or wrong approach, but it's simply worth noting that this is the way the world is going, and certainly California is going. The key to it is shifting costs from the state to the counties. Yes, that could be sleight of hand that at least solves the state budget problem to some extent, depending on how much the state actually ultimately has to subsidize the counties. The theory, though, is that there really are things that the counties can do better and more efficiently than the state. That gap, that difference may be exaggerated, but I think it's real to some extent. It could take a couple of forms. One would require some changes in the penal code, but not drastic ones. And that is, there are certain very low-level felonies, sometimes they're called wobblers, things that could be felonies or misdemeanors, which could be redefined to always be misdemeanors, certain DUIs, certain drug offenses, so that people convicted of those crimes simply can't go to the state prisons. They will have to go to the counties. You might say, aren't the county jails overcrowded? A, yes, they are. But B, not all of them are. There are some county jails with space. The state prisons have no space. But the other part of it is, and boy, am I no economist, but let me just try this soundbite out, question of negative externalities and aligning incentives. The counties or the cities, through their municipal police forces, make most of the front-end decisions about who then goes into state prison, just through investigation, prosecution, and all that. So there's some internalization of costs if the counties have to bear the cost of incarcerating people. So that's in terms of the actual definition of crimes. The other thing, though, and probably the more dramatic thing, gets back to parole. Many states have unified or aligned their parole and probation processes because there's some overlap, there's some similarity in terms of the work of supervision. So it's pretty clear that the major thing that the Brown administration is going to be at least thinking about, if not pushing, is shifting parole supervision back to the counties, either by sending the parole agents into county offices or just, in a sense, moving job titles, job lines from state to county, on the theory that the supervision can be done much better back home, because obviously a major problem in California, given our recidivism rate, is the recycling of people in and out. Rehab programs, reentry programs are barely existing in California right now. The theory is internalization, partly in terms of costs, but partly in a more mundane sense of internalization, keep things local, and there might ultimately be, not sleight of hand, but actual cost savings in terms of getting released inmates closer to social services that, at the margin, might enable them to stay out of state prison. So that's what the picture looks like now.
Thank you very much. Okay, our final initial speaker is another policy guru, Mark Kleiman from the Policy School at UCLA.
Thank you. So let me start with a little bit of. No, I'm not John Elwood. I am not. Nor have I ever been John.
They gave me a different one. So.
Yeah, right. So let me start out with a little caveat. I'm going to talk about cutting the corrections budget. Notice we had not talked about the California Highway Patrol. Now that Wells Fargo is no longer sending wagon loads of gold, it's not at all clear that California needs a highway patrol at anything like its current level. But that has been a sacred cow for a long time. So I'm going to talk about cutting the corrections budget. But I got to start out by saying that in a sane world, cutting the corrections budget would not be high on anybody's agenda. There are at least two things about our correction system that are much more important than how much money we spend on it. One is crime. Right? I mean, yes, crime is down very substantially, but California, like the rest of the U.S., has about 5 times the homicide rate of any civilized country. We forget that, and that's enormously concentrated in already hard-hit neighborhoods. The concentration of crime in this country and the concentration of incarceration by race and class is really quite frightening. So we've got a crime problem, and incarceration is one of the things we do about that, and if we do anything about incarceration that makes the crime problem worse, I claim that any money we save will not have been well saved. The other thing about the incarceration system is the enormous suffering that it imposes on inmates and on the people who care about them and on the neighborhoods they come from, which are those very same hard-hit, high-crime, poor, minority, urban neighborhoods. We also have 5 times the incarceration rate of any civilized country. Right? If you add prisons and jails, the U.S. runs about 750 prisoners per 100,000 population. So if you exclude children, right, that's about 1% of the adult population of the U.S. is behind bars at any one time. The U.K. runs about 140. The Netherlands runs about 70. Right? So we have 10 times the incarceration rate of lots of other countries. We also have 5 times the incarceration rate that we had 40 years ago. Right? There's a wonderful paper by Al Blumstein, who's the Dean of American Criminology, written about 1979, asking the question, why is the incarceration rate a constant? He looked at the historical incarceration rates from 1900 to 1975, and they stood within a band of 120 to 140 per 100,000 population. That was true with crime increase and crime decrease. It was true with war and peace. It was true with boom and bust. There was some social constant that kept the incarceration rate fixed, and Blumstein wanted to know what that was. Well, it was a great paper, except that it stopped being true the day it was written. So we went from that 120 to 140 per 100,000 to 750. It's getting to be harder to sing Land of the Free. We should regard our incarceration rate now as a problem on a social level with our crime rate. So how much we spend on the prisons has got to be the least important aspect of them, unless you're at the University of California competing with the prisons for budget money. So in a sane world, we would not be talking about saving money on corrections. We'd be talking about other things, but we don't live in a sane world. We live in California. So I'm going to talk about what I was told to talk about. As Steve Raphael says, sentencing drives the system. Sentencing plus release rules plus reincarceration rules under probation and parole. So we need to either change the laws, which in the case of Prop 13 would mean, 3 strikes would mean changing the California Constitution. Part of what's driven that increase in geriatric corrections is that 3 strikes says you can't let anybody out early who's been convicted of a violent crime. Or we have to change prosecutor behavior. Right? One of the odd things about devolving parole supervision to the county level is that a parole revocation leads to incarceration in a state prison. So right now, the parole hearings are under the corrections department. So everybody they send back is somebody they have to house. So that cost is now well internalized. If you put parole at the county level, then Orange County could do what it did when it was bankrupt, which is get rid of all its problem people by sending them to state prison. So that seems like a backwards step to me. But the more general problem that Bob Weisberg pointed out is exactly right, that we have lots of county-level decisions that impact the state budget. And a number of states have gone to a model that's called justice reinvestment, which essentially means sharing the cost or the cost saving of incarceration with the counties that generate it. I'm going to talk about a program on probation called HOPE, which I'm convinced can vastly decrease the number of people who go to prison. But it's a probation program, which means it's a county program. And for some reason, when I tell officials in Los Angeles County that by spending millions of dollars, they could save the state tens of millions of dollars, I don't get a very warm reception to that idea. In Arizona and in the state of Washington, that would be money directly to the county's bottom line. So that is a structural reform that might make some of these policy reforms easier. But back to Steve Raphael's point. What drives the cost is the number of people we have in prison. Right? If we want to, we can't save any money out of our current prisons. I mean, Governor Schwarzenegger wanted to send everybody to Kentucky and put them in Corrections Corporation of America units, but that's not going to happen. Shouldn't happen. So we have to deal with our prison head count. And again, I think we should not be thinking small. We have 5 times the incarceration we had the last time we had our current crime rate. So we should not be thinking in marginal terms. We should be thinking about very large cuts in the number of people we have confined. After all, other places in the world seem to be able to manage a relatively low crime rate without keeping 1% of adults behind bars. The brutal fact about the incarceration process is that the distribution of offending rates among inmates is enormously skewed. Jan and Marcia Chaikin discovered 40 years ago now that if you survey prison inmates and ask them about the crimes they committed the year before they went in, 10% of the inmates, right, already a very selected group of criminals, 10% of the state prison inmates were responsible for 50% of the crimes committed by all the prison inmates. The median prisoner was committing, in California, around 17 offenses per year. The average prisoner was committing about 170. So the median prisoner, the bottom half of the prisoners in California, are not worth keeping. The crimes they would otherwise be committing aren't big enough to pay, even ignoring their suffering, just from the taxpayer point of view, to pay the cost of keeping the $45,000 a year. But the average prisoner, right, averaging in those 10% of really active offenders, oh, that person's really well worth keeping. And the problem is that there's lots of loose talk about low-level, first-time, nonviolent offenders. That turns out not to select a group of people you can safely let out. Because one thing you know about a low-level, first-time, nonviolent offender is he's young. And the fact that he's in there for a nonviolent crime does not mean he's a nonviolent person. The fact that he's in there for a drug offense doesn't mean that he's just a drug user. Steve showed the data that the number of people in California prisons for drug-defined offenses went down as a result of Prop 36. But Angela Hawken did the analysis of the actual Prop 36 population and discovered that their incarceration did not go down as a result of Prop 36. It was merely postponed a couple of years. And they went back in for the other crimes they were committing to pay for their drug habit or as part of their generally disordered life. So figuring out which 10% of the prisoners are really worth keeping and which 50% you could easily let out is a much harder problem in reality than it looks like on paper. So it all goes back to the story about Robert McNamara when he got to be Secretary of Defense, and a reporter said to him, "Mr. Secretary, isn't it true that half of the defense budget is wasted?" And McNamara said, "Yes. Now tell me which half." So, it is not the case that there's a group of people in prison, other than the geriatrics, that you could safely let out in the sense of not having a Willie Horton somewhere in the group. Right? We got predictive models that will tell you who's more or less dangerous. But it doesn't get to zero until you're in the geriatric oncology unit. As Phil Hyman said when Prop 13 passed, you just voted to convert your prisons into retirement homes for former burglars. And that's right. Fixing that's going to be hard because it's going to mean fixing the 3 strikes law. But yes, the fact that our prisons are an increasing proportion of people over 40 means they're doing us less and less good. So, the key to spending less money, imposing less suffering, and having less crime is to be able to prevent crime by offenders when they're not behind bars. If we can't learn to punish people and control their future behavior without paying their room and board bill, then we can't get a handle on this problem. But the key fact here is that cells are expensive. $45,000 on average, probably $25,000 at the margin is a reasonable guess. Monitoring is cheap. We spend about $1,000 a year on probationers. We spend about $3,000 a year on parolees. So insofar as that community corrections, out of incarceration monitoring has some impact on those people's crime rates, we can get a big bang for our buck by doing a little less incarceration and using that money to do a lot more supervision. Now, the problem is that our current supervision efforts aren't really very effective. It's true a lot of people go back for violating their probation and parole terms, but they tend to go back after their 8th or 9th or 10th violation, since the probation and parole system are aware that they don't want to send a lot of people away. And so we have the worst of all possible worlds, a lot of people going back, but not very much control. Right? So Joe and Peter Cilia did a famous study looking at what happened when you vastly increased the resources available for probation supervision, intensively supervised probation. Answer, no decrease in crime by the people on the intensive supervision. And I think the reason is that we don't have any potent sanctioning system. Right? The kind of people who wind up on probation and parole don't respond very well to deferred, low probability threats of drastic consequences. Right? If you responded to that threat, you wouldn't be a crack-using burglar in the first place. What every mother knows, what every animal trainer knows, what anybody who's coached a sports team knows, is that if you want to change somebody's behavior, you need clear rules, you need immediate consequences that happen every time for violation of those rules, and you can change behavior without inflicting a lot of actual punishment. Right? So we need to, if our probation and parole system were a parent, we would call it both abusive and neglectful. And of course, a lot of people in that system had abusive and neglectful parents. We simply reproduced everything that led to their being who they are. That's what has to change. So here's the good news. A judge in Hawaii named Steve Alm invented a program called HOPE, which puts probationers under good parenting. They're drug tested frequently, and every time they use, they're going to spend a small amount of time in jail. A couple of days for the first offense, might escalate over time. They're not required to go to treatment until they've repeatedly failed on this very simple process of monitoring and sanctioning. That actually makes good clinical sense. The definition of substance abuse clinically is continued use despite adverse consequences. So this is a system that sets up the adverse consequences. If you observe continued use, well, you've now made your diagnosis. You can focus your treatment resources, as Prop 36 doesn't, on the people who really need it. So my colleague Angela Hawken calls this behavioral triage. The best predictor of behavior is observed behavior. And it turns out with drug testing, we can observe somebody's behavior pretty quickly and cheaply. And if we do the immediate sanctioning, it turns out most of those people will in fact stop using, which is strongly correlated with their not committing more property crimes. So in Hawaii, putting methamphetamine using mostly probationers on HOPE screening reduced their arrests for new crimes by 50%. Reduced their return to prison by 2/3. Paid for itself about 4 times over in reduced incarceration rates. And they actually didn't spend any more time in jail than regular probationers. They were more likely to spend some time, less likely to spend a lot of time. Now, imagine that you added to the drug testing position monitoring with an ankle bracelet, GPS ankle bracelet. You could now say to somebody, all right, we're not going to put you in prison for stealing a car, but you're on a 9 p.m. curfew for the next 6 months. That's your penalty. And you're wearing the ankle bracelet. And if you aren't where you're supposed to be after 9 p.m., and if you're not at your anger management class when you're supposed to be there, and if you're not at work when you're supposed to be there, or if you're in the neighborhood where you used to deal drugs, where you're told not to be, or if you're near the apartment of the girlfriend you used to beat up, if any of those things happen, we'll know about it. And you're going to spend a couple days in jail just to remind you that the rules actually are the rules. The notion of non-revocable parole, which was brought in as a budget reform by Der Schwarzengroper, struck me as insane. Because if parole isn't revocable, then the parole officer's orders are no more than helpful hints. I agree that sending somebody back to prison for months for a technical violation makes no sense. But you need some sanction other than, don't do that again, to make parole work. So trying to make parole non-revocable means that prison's the only alternative you have if you actually want to be able to control somebody's behavior. So the key is swift and certain sanctioning. I'm prepared to bet that the combination of drug testing and GPS monitoring. Remember, the other thing about the GPS anklet is very hard to commit a new crime and get away with it. Because I'll have a record that you were in the apartment that was being burglarized at 3 o'clock in the morning. Some people will take the anklet off. Good. They have nominated themselves for a prison cell. Anybody who wears the anklet is probably relatively safe. And so that's the key to drastically reducing our prison population while also reducing our crime rate. So parole plus drug testing plus GPS, I think you could probably do for about $5,000 a year compared to the $25,000 you could save by letting somebody out. So for every person I release or don't send to prison or don't send back to prison, I can closely monitor 5 people. That, I claim, is the key to spending less money, imposing less suffering, and having less crime. And I think our goal should be to have a quarter as many prisoners in California 10 years from now as we have today. Thank you.
Okay, what we'd like to do now is to give each of the panelists a chance to comment on what the other panelists said, moving toward a general discussion. And then at the end of that, I want to make a quasi-controversial comment. But go ahead. Did anybody have any comments? Steve?
Well, I agree with just about everything that everyone has said. I guess one issue that I might raise is it sounds like Mark isn't a big fan of the non-revocable parole reform. So that as Bob had already mentioned, non-revocable parole was an innovation, I think, was introduced in January 2009, I believe. And what it does is it basically uses a sort of statistical risk instrument, like an actuarial instrument, to predict which paroled offenders are more likely to sort of recidivate, and then it lops off the bottom of that distribution and basically says, we're not going to supervise you and we're not going to revoke your parole, with the idea of concentrating the resources of the parole agents on the more dangerous offenders. And despite the fact that we've given that a name, and it was a legislative innovation here, it's kind of what every other state in the country does, in the sense that not everybody that's released is released on parole. And consequently, they, in other states, they don't have the return to custody rate that California has. So while it might not necessarily be a good thing to let some people off without any community supervision, to be able to concentrate resources on perhaps more criminally active offenders seems that on balance, despite the fact some of those non-revocable parole people are going to do horrible things, that's going to be counterbalanced by the people who we monitor closely who are perhaps going to do, would have done horrible things that we prevent. So I think that the non-revocable parole thing was a step in the right direction, personally. That's it. Other than that,
Just to respond to that, I mean, I'd like to see the evidence that increasing parole supervision resources for the concentrated group is going to matter. The intensively supervised probation experiment suggests the opposite. Unless we change the sanctioning rules, I don't think it matters how closely you watch people.
But my reading of that Petersilia study was that when you look at people more closely, you find more things to revoke their parole. That's
right. Well, that was the reason they were going to prison, back to prison more often. But what she didn't find, and I think this surprised everybody, was they didn't commit any fewer new crimes. So if you went from probation caseloads of 150 to probation caseloads of 25, you got zero dose effect on criminality. So I doubt there's any evidence that doing more scrutiny of people when you don't have a swift and reliable sanctioning system matters at all.
This is a very crucial point, and I think, as Mark says, we just don't have very clear evidence. To pick up on Steve's point, here's a way of looking at it. It's possible that non-revocable parole, it could be a very an economically sensible system if the people you weren't supervising and probably weren't revoking, you could still get revoked, and, if you did something serious enough, were the people you just didn't worry about that much, in effect, who shouldn't be on parole at all. They just aren't threats. Now, those measurements could be wrong, but they could be right, and in a time of scarce budget, in time of budget constraints, in effect, certain people are not dangerous enough to be costing the criminal justice system anything. The irony is that you could theoretically achieve some rational cost-benefit savings at the cost of violating the law of California. It's almost a kind of self-directed civil disobedience. We legislated rules that require these people to be on parole, and then we kind of take them off parole. One other point, Mark raised a good point about how if parole agents are deciding who goes back into prison, the cost is internalized, and that's certainly true in the sense of state versus county. Again, speaking as a non-economist, I'd say that there are kind of externalities built in within the state system, of course, as between the parole people and, the prison people. They're all technically in the same department, but they have some different incentives. I simply want to note, not to disagree with Mark substantially on this, that even though parole agents are necessary figures in determining whether somebody goes back to state prison, they're not sufficient, and they're not even always the most important, because there's a lot of power in county prosecutors to decide if they see somebody committing a small crime, whether to call up the parole officer. The parole officer is probably involved in the conversation at that point anyway, and say, why don't we just call this a revocation? So there's still some externalization there.
Right, but it's worth noting what a completely insane system we currently have. Parolees know the maximum sentence on a parole revocation is a year. So if you commit a new burglary on parole and the lazy prosecutor says, nah, process it as a revocation, you've gotten a much less severe sentence than you would have gotten had you not been on parole. So the best time to commit a felony in California is while you're currently on parole.
Because not too bad a felony.
It's not too bad, yeah. Because not only do you get a shorter sentence, it doesn't count as a strike. Right? So somebody who does a burglary, gets out on parole, does another, and gets off parole, does another burglary, gets convicted again, has now a second strike. Somebody who does a burglary, commits a second burglary while he's still on parole and has it processed as a parole violation, still doesn't have a second strike. We have created a safe haven for criminal activity among California parolees. Madness.
Okay, Steve, any more comments?
Yeah, maybe one further comment. So just with regards to whether or not we can identify the half of the budget that's a waste, within the state system, the level of security that is imposed on inmates varies tremendously. So you can go, for example, I'm working on a project, and we visited New Folsom Prison, which has a level 1 facility and a level 4 facility, one right next to the other. We toured both of them. And level 1, the housing is actually outside of the triple electric fence, and the inmates will sort of maintain the gardens on the outside. The guards would tell me that sometimes they'd leave in the middle of the night and meet girlfriends, and that there was quite a bit of porousness between the outside world and access to the level 1 guys. And they actually don't really have that much by way of escape attempts. Every now and then, one of the examples I heard, someone's mother died and the person was distraught and he walked away in the middle of the night. Like, things like that do happen. But for the most part, people are compliant. They don't have much more time to do. They don't want to get into a lot of trouble. And then you go into level 4, on the other hand, and people are being escorted by 2 guards in straitjackets and shackles with spit hoods over their head, and kept in little phone booth-sized cages while they're awaiting meetings with their, captains, or for whatever their revocation hearings. It's an entirely different situation. And somehow the system is making this distinction that these guys merit, this extra security, while these others are able to get along. And so we are, to a certain degree, Whether or not we're getting it right is another thing. So one of the interesting things I saw there is, you know, in the level 4, the inmates that are under close custody and spend a lot of time in their cell have to spend a couple hours a day outside, and they literally wheel, you know, they bring the people into a cage. It looks like an animal cage, and that's their outside time. And I saw, must have been a man in his 70s, wheeled into a wheelchair in one of these cages. And it's just, you're watching that going, well, this cannot be a good expenditure of resources, right? It just didn't seem, but, you know, so there's going to be type 1 and type 2 errors, clearly. But I think that the prison, the correctional officers and the people in charge of the system think that they can tell who really needs that extra scrutiny and who doesn't. So, you know, it's never going to be perfect, and we will let someone out that we think is low risk that'll do something bad. But there's also people out there that we think are no risk that are going to do something bad, right? And that's just the fact of life, right? That's the problem when we're trying to actuarially predict bad things.
If I could just add one very quick point on that, it bears on something I think maybe John raised about privatization, sending prisoners out of state, which doesn't necessarily, but it almost always means sending them to the custody of the Corrections Corporation of America. Talk about sleight of hand. When they prove their greater cost efficiency, they often do it in pretty crude figures in terms of cost per inmate. They don't get the really scary people. They don't want the really scary people. They're cherry picking, you know, the somewhat long-term but pretty safe people.
Okay. Can I make one comment as we go from this session to higher ed in particular and to healthcare? And that is to say, what you have, I'll call you a policy person if you don't mind, even though you're a law professor.
Go for it.
Everybody on this panel is focusing in on what's the right policy. There is an old-fashioned different way of viewing the problem. How much money do I have? And view that as a fixed amount, and what do I do if I have to stay with it? It's sort of an old-fashioned public administration view of the world. On this panel, we've moved very far from that. And we've turned essentially criminal justice into an entitlement or a mandated spending. And it might be a very different world if you were in an old-fashioned public administration. Here's my budget. You're going to stay within the budget. And by the way, this is beginning to look like the University of California. Here's my budget. Here's how much you get in terms of the state legislature. Live within it, folks. But yet we move over to criminal justice and we treat it as an entirely different type of activity. And I'm not sure what's right. I'm just sort of commenting on the fact of the way we're approaching this topic.
Well, anybody who wants to see me afterwards, I have a plan for taking $2.5 billion out of the institutional corrections budget, spending $1.5 billion of that on better community supervision, better policing, more courts, more prosecutors, leaving $1 billion for Cal State and the UC system.
Thank you very much.